They called me mad. Until my hill saved 9 lives.
The morning they buried Glendon Birdsong, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the ground was still too frozen to dig properly. 4 men took turns with the pickaxe before the hole was deep enough, and Ottilie stood at the edge of it in her black coat and watched them work without saying a word. The preacher read from his worn Bible. 14 people stood in a loose half circle around the grave, their breath making small clouds in the April air, their eyes moving between the coffin and the widow and the middle distance where it was safer to look. When it was done, they filed past her with their condolences, their pressed hands, their careful voices. She thanked each one. She remembered none of their words. Glendon had been in the ravine since February, 2 months under the snow, while Ottilie kept a candle burning in the window and told herself it meant nothing, the candle. It was just something to do with her hands in the evenings. The search parties had tried for 2 weeks before the drifts made it impossible. She had known by the end of the first week. She had known the way you know a hard winter is coming when you feel it in the walls of the cabin before the temperature even drops. You do not need a thermometer to understand cold. You just need to have lived long enough inside it. 3 days after the funeral, Whitfield Holloway came to the claim. He was 52 years old and he owned more land in that valley than anyone else, which meant that when he rode onto your property and stepped down from his horse, there was a particular kind of weight that came with him. Not cruelty exactly, more like certainty. The certainty of a man who had made enough correct decisions over enough years that he had stopped seriously entertaining the possibility of being wrong. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at the cabin and then at the hills behind it and then at Ottilie. And he told her that he understood her situation. The claim was isolated. The land had no reliable water source within reasonable distance. The soil on the lower acres was too rocky for serious cultivation. A woman managing this alone through a Montana winter was not a small thing, not a thing to be undertaken lightly, and he wanted her to know that he was prepared to offer her a fair price, $40. She could move into town, start fresh. Ottilie was standing at the kitchen table when he said this. She had been looking at a piece of paper. She did not look up from it immediately. She said, "This land has something you have not thought about, Mr. Holloway." He waited. She said, "It has depth." She poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of the chair across from her. Holloway looked at the cup. He looked at Ottilie. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table, and he left without drinking the tea. She watched him ride away down the trail until the bend took him out of sight. Then she looked back at the paper on the table. It was a deed. Glendon had signed it in January, meaning to file it with the land office in the spring. He never made it to spring. The deed was valid. The land was hers. But she would need to file it herself, and soon before anyone with an interest in the matter thought to look too closely at the gap. She set the deed aside and opened the box she had taken from the shelf above the fireplace. Glendon had kept it locked, but she had known where the key was for years, the way long married people know each other's hiding places without ever discussing them. Inside the box was the usual collection of a man's private papers. Letters from his mother back in England, receipts, of photograph of the 2 of them taken in the first year on the claim before the hard winters had worked their way into their faces. And at the bottom beneath everything else, a small notebook with a leather cover worn soft from handling. She opened it. The first 20 pages were Glendon's handwriting. Lists, measurements, observations about the land in different seasons. Then near the middle of the notebook, the handwriting changed character. It became slower, more deliberate, as if the writer was thinking through each mark on the page. There were sketches, rough ones not drawn by a man with any particular gift for drafting, but clear enough in their intention. A cross-section of a hillside, a horizontal tunnel going in from the face of the slope, a wider chamber at the end of the tunnel, a small hearth against the back wall with a line going up at an angle through the earth above it to emerge on the surface 20 feet higher. Below the last sketch, Glendon had written 5 words. "Next winter we try this." Ottilie sat with the notebook open in her lap for a long time. Outside, the April wind moved through the new grass on the hillside behind the cabin. The same hillside. The exact slope he had sketched, she realized. He had been looking at the same hill she had been looking at her whole time on this claim, and thinking the same things she had been thinking, and neither of them had ever said it out loud to the other. And now one of them was in the ground, and the other was sitting at a kitchen table in Montana, holding a notebook that felt like a message sent from somewhere she could not write back to. She closed the notebook carefully. She set it on the table next to the deed. Then she stood up and walked to the window and looked at the hillside for a while without moving. She had grown up in a mining family in Cornwall on the southwestern coast of England, where the land was ancient and worked through and full of tunnels that men had spent generations carving into it. Her father had spent 30 years underground, and he had come home each evening smelling of earth and stone and the particular mineral darkness of deep places. He had told her things around the dinner table that she had stored without knowing she was storing them the way children absorb everything before they understand what any of it means. He told her that below a certain depth, the earth held its temperature regardless of what the surface was doing. In summer, the tunnels were cool when the ground above baked. In winter, the tunnels were warm when the world above froze. The earth had its own climate stable and indifferent to seasons, and if you went deep enough into it, you found something that the surface world almost never offered. Steadiness, predictability, a temperature that did not depend on what the sky decided to do. She had visited the old mines as a girl and felt it for herself. Standing in a shaft 50 feet down with the cold wind of an October storm raging somewhere far above, feeling nothing but the patient warmth of the rock around her. She had never forgotten it. Glendon had laughed when she mentioned it their first year on the claim. "We are not moles," he said. "We are people. People live above ground." He was not wrong to laugh. It was an unusual idea, but he had come around to it eventually quietly on his own and drawn it out in a notebook he kept locked in a box, and then he had fallen into a ravine in February before he could say the word out loud. Ottilie was 31 years old. She had the deed, she had the notebook, she had the hillside. She spent the summer preparing. She went to the territorial library in town 3 times and borrowed every book they had on mining and excavation, which amounted to 3 books. 2 of them outdated and 1 of them written by a man who clearly had more enthusiasm than experience. She read all 3. She went to the saloon in the evenings, which was not the kind of thing a widow was expected to do, and she sat across from old prospectors and bought them drinks and asked them questions. Not general questions, specific ones. She wanted to know about shoring, about drainage, about the particular way wet earth behaved differently from dry earth under the weight of a timber beam. The old men were surprised at first and then pleased, and they talked more freely than they might have otherwise, and Ottilie listened to everything and said very little. She studied the hillside behind the cabin through the whole summer, walking it in different lights, in different weathers, pressing her hands into the soil at different points, looking for what she needed. The top of the slope was too rocky. The base was too close to the water table. But in the middle third of the hill at a particular angle where the drainage ran naturally away from the face, there was a band of clay soil. She could feel the difference of the moment her fingers pressed into it. Dense, cohesive, the kind of soil that held its shape under pressure instead of crumbling. When the leaves began to turn in September, she started digging. The first morning she drove the pickaxe into the hillside at 7 in the morning and did not stop until the light failed. By the end of the day, she had a gash in the earth roughly 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, ragged at the edges and full of severed roots, but real. A beginning. Rook sat on his blanket near the base of the hill and watched her with his patient amber eyes, his tail making slow sweeps through the fallen leaves as if he had decided some time ago that whatever his person chose to do was probably the right thing, and he was content to wait it out. On the second morning, Whitfield Holloway rode by. He sat his horse at the edge of her claim and watched her work for a full 10 minutes before he said anything. She knew he was there. She kept swinging. He said, "There is no gold in that hill, Mrs. Birdsong. The prospectors checked it years ago." She said, "I know that." He said, "Then what are you doing?" She said, "Building a home." There was a silence. Then she heard him laugh. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard something that fits perfectly into a story. He was already telling himself the story about the widow who was not handling things well, who had refused sensible advice, and was now doing something eccentric and probably dangerous that would prove his point for him eventually. Rook lifted his head at the sound of it and made a low noise in his throat. Holloway said, "Ma'am, with respect, your husband left you that cabin not 200 yards from here. It has 4 walls and a roof and a fireplace. What more does a woman need? Ottilie paused. She set the pickaxe down on the ground and straightened and looked at him directly for the first time since he had ridden up. She said, "My husband is dead, Mr. Holloway. The cabin he built has walls so thin I can hear the wind laughing at me through every crack. Last winter, I burned every stick of furniture we owned just to keep from freezing, and I still woke up with ice in my hair. This winter, I am going to sleep warm. I am going to do it underground, where the cold cannot reach me." Holloway shook his head the way men do when they have decided a woman has lost her mind, and further argument would be wasted on her. He said, "Suit yourself, but when that tunnel collapses on your head, do not expect anyone to dig you out." He rode away without looking back. Ottilie watched him go. Then she picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. In the days that followed, the neighbors came in ones and twos and threes, drawn by whatever combination of concern and curiosity, and the simple human inability to ignore an unusual sight that brings people out of their houses when something unexpected is happening nearby. Nora Bramston came from 3 miles east, a woman who had made something of a vocation out of knowing things and predicting outcomes, and she stood at the edge of the excavation and told Ottilie that the spring snowmelt would fill the hole like a bathtub and drown everything inside it. Her husband Burwell came separately and told Ottilie that Earth was not meant to hang over empty space, that God had made ceilings out of wood and stone and not dirt. A young man named Cass Norgate, who worked as a hand on Holloway's ranch, rode past one afternoon going fast and called out without stopping that his father had tried to dig a well once and hit granite at 8 feet and broke 2 pickaxes doing it. He was laughing when he said it. He did not slow down. Ottilie listened to all of them. She thanked them for their concern. She kept digging. The second week brought her to the clay bands she had located in her summer surveys, and the difference was immediate and unmistakable. Where the upper soil had fought her every swing, crumbling and collapsing and giving way in ways that required constant reshaping, the clay compacted under the pressure of her tool instead of yielding to it. She carved into it, and the wall held its form. She shaped the edges of her excavation, and they stayed shaped. She took a large handful of the material and pressed it hard between her palms, and when she opened her hands, the compressed shape remained intact, the fingerprints visible in its surface. This was the thing her father had told her about, the thing she had looked for all summer, without being certain she would find it. Clay this dense behaved differently from ordinary soil under the weight of a timber frame. It would compress and seal rather than shift and crack. It stored thermal energy the way a stone stores the warmth of a fire, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it back over hours after the source was gone. Packed around a wooden framework and left to dry, it would cure into a surface nearly as hard as brick, and it would hold the steady temperature of the deep earth, the same temperature she had felt as a girl standing 50 feet underground in a Cornwall shaft, while a storm raged above, better than any wall her husband had ever built with timber. She began to shape the space deliberately now. The entrance tunnel she kept narrow, just wide enough for her shoulders angled upward from the outside so water would drain toward the entrance rather than collecting in the main chamber. Behind the entrance, she excavated an oval room, carving it out foot by foot, 12 feet from front to back, 10 feet across at its widest, and 7 feet tall at the center so she could stand upright without bending. The shoring took 4 days. She had traded 3 months of butter and eggs to the sawmill owner for a stack of pine logs, and she spent 2 days cutting them to length and another 2 fitting them into position, vertical posts every 4 feet along the walls, with horizontal beams across the ceiling, each beam notched to lock into the posts above it. The fit had to be exact. A beam too short offered nothing. A beam a half-inch too long refused a seat. She learned to cut and test fit and cut again, and she learned the sounds that good timber made, underload the particular creak that meant a beam was carrying a weight properly versus the different lower sound that meant something was about to fail. She made mistakes. She made them and fixed them and made different ones. One of her early ceiling beams had a hidden crack along a buried grain line invisible from the outside, and it gave way one evening when she was fitting the adjacent piece, dropping 6 inches before the neighboring timbers caught the load. She stood in the chamber in the near dark, listening to the earth above her make small sounds of adjustment, and she did not move for several minutes. Then she got the lantern from the entrance, located her spare timber, and worked until 3 in the morning, replacing the failed beam in the confined space with her arms shaking from 12 hours of previous labor. She did not stop until the new beam was locked into place and tested and the earth above had gone quiet. In the last week of September, Deputy Marshal Truxton Merrifield came to her property for the first time. Merrifield was 44 years old, lean, in the way that suggested an economy of everything, words and movement and sentiment alike. He had a face built for delivering information without editorial, and he used it now to inform Ottilie that a complaint had been filed with the county office regarding her excavation work. He read from the document in his hand, his voice as level as a man reading a grocery list. The complaint, signed by the Whitfield Holloway, cited concern about public safety. An unshored hillside excavation near a common trail presented potential hazard to passersby. As a property owner with liability under territorial law, she was advised to be aware of her legal exposure in the event of any incident. Ottilie looked at the document. She looked at Merrifield. She said, "Thank you for the notification, Deputy Marshal Merrifield. I will keep that in mind." Merrifield folded the paper and returned it to his coat. He said, "The complaint is on record, ma'am. I am not making a judgment about your work. I am informing you of your legal standing." He rode away with the same measured efficiency with which he had arrived. Ottilie watched him go. Then she looked across the valley toward the roofline of Holloway's main house, visible above the tree line to the northwest. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned and went inside the cabin, took the box with Glendon's papers from the shelf, and sat down at the table. It took her most of the night to find what she was looking for. The deed she had already found. But there were other papers, earlier ones, records of the original claim filing and the subsequent transfers. And in those papers was a line that told her something Holloway had clearly already known when he came to her the week after the funeral. Glendon had completed every step of the land registration process except the final filing. He had done the work. He had prepared the documents. He had simply not made it to the land office before February. Holloway had known the deed was unfiled. He had come to buy the claim not because he was being neighborly, but because an unfiled deed was a vulnerability. And he was the kind of man who noticed vulnerabilities in other people's situations before they did. Ottilie rode into town the following morning and filed the deed herself. The clerk stamped it without comment. The land was hers, registered and complete. But she understood now that Holloway had not come to buy the land out of sympathy or community feeling. He had come because he thought he saw an opening, and the fact that she had closed it would not make him less interested in the property, only more careful about how he approached it. She rode home and went back to digging. But she kept the bundle of papers on the kitchen table from that point on, where she could see it. October came, and with it a cold snap that arrived 2 weeks early and settled over the valley like a judgment. Holloway's ranch lost 2 calves in a single night. The Bramston farm discovered their root cellar had flooded, spoiling half the winter stores they had spent the summer building. The first snow fell on the 3rd of October and did not melt. Ottilie was now in the finishing phases of her main chamber. The fireplace she built from stones carried up from the creek below a compact structure against the back wall with a firebox no more than 2 feet wide. The chimney did not go straight up. It ran at an angle of roughly 35 degrees, boring through the clay of the hillside at a diagonal before emerging from the face of the slope 20 feet above the entrance. The design came from the ventilation systems she had read about in the Cornwall mining literature, and from her father's descriptions of how underground air moved, how heat rose along any upward path available to it, and created a natural draw that pulled combustion gases out without any mechanical assistance. The angle also meant that rain and snow fell straight down onto the outside air rather than into the flue, which would have driven smoke back into the chamber. She tested the draw on a cold morning with a small fire and a piece of wet cloth that made thick smoke. The smoke pulled cleanly through the chimney and dispersed from the hillside above without a trace of backdraft. She sat in the chamber with the small fire burning and watched the temperature on her husband's brass thermometer rise from the ambient underground warmth to something considerably above it, and she let herself feel for just a moment something very close to satisfaction. It was around this time in the middle of October that a man she had not expected came to her property. Bassett Holloway was 68 years old, a retired justice of the peace who had come to Montana from Ohio 12 years earlier and now lived alone on a small farm 6 miles up the valley. He had a white beard and the deliberate movements of a man who had learned that most situations improved when you approach them slowly. He had heard about the complaint Merrifield had served on Ottilie, and he had heard about the excavation, and something about the combination of the two had made him curious enough to ride over. He accepted the cup of coffee she offered and read the complaint document she had kept a copy of, and then he read the territorial housing statute that Merrifield had cited, the one requiring a source of natural light in any habitable dwelling. He read it the way a man reads something when he has already guessed what is in it and is looking for the specific word that will confirm his guess. He found it on the third page. The light requirement, he told her, applied to structures used as a primary residence. It did not apply to storage structures, root cellars, or ancillary buildings provided the owner maintained a separate primary dwelling. Ottilie still had the cabin. The cabin had windows. As long as the cabin stood, the chamber in the hillside was legally a storage and utility structure, regardless of how she actually used it. She would simply need to not announce the contrary to anyone official. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and looked at her with the calm interest of a man who had spent 30 years listening to people's problems and had learned to find most of them genuinely interesting. He asked, "Are you actually planning to live in that chamber?" She said yes. He said, "Then do not tell Truxton Merrifield that." It was the first time she had laughed since April. It was not a long laugh, but it was real, and Holloway looked pleased with himself in the quiet way of a man who rarely lets his pleasure show, but does not bother to hide it entirely. He came back twice more before winter, and she found that she valued his visits in the straightforward way that useful things are valuable without sentiment, because he knew things she needed to know, and he did not charge for knowing them, and he did not make her feel as if knowing them made her obligated to him. The rest of October she spent on the interior. She laid plank flooring over packed earth. She built shelves into the wall niches, cut directly into the clay, and framed with short timber lengths. She hung bundles of pine branches from the ceiling beams for the scent and for the mild antiseptic property of the resin. She wove rugs from fabric scraps and placed them on the floor. She built a bed frame from the straightest timber she had left and fitted it with a rope lattice and a mattress she had remade from corn husks and old wool batting. Rook accepted the space without ceremony. On the first day, she brought his blanket inside and set it near the hearth. He walked in, circled once, and lay down in a way that suggested he had expected this all along and saw no reason to comment on it. He positioned himself where he could see both the fire and the tunnel entrance, which was where he had always preferred to be in the cabin as well, watching over two things at once in case one of them needed him. November passed in work and cold, and the gradual process of a community revising its assessment of something it had already decided to dismiss. Nora Bramston came to ask about the chimney design after her own farmhouse chimney collapsed under wet snow. Burwell Bramston came to ask about firewood. Whitfield Holloway came one afternoon and stood at the entrance and asked to see inside. Ottilie gave him the lantern. He was inside for about 10 minutes. When he came out, the expression on his face was different from every expression she had seen on it before, the certainty gone and something more complicated in its place. He said, "It is warm in there, different from out here." She said, 5 degrees, year-round. He stood there for a moment working through what that meant without her assistance. Then he said, "I thought you were out of your mind when you started this. I want you to know that I know I was wrong about that." He rode away slowly and looked back twice before the trail bent and took him out of sight. Ottilie allowed herself to watch him go. She did not say anything. She did not need to. November brought other things. On a morning in the second week, Ottilie came back from a long day working on the outer drainage channel she had been improving, and she found that someone had left a bundle of split firewood stacked neatly against the side of the hill near the chamber entrance. Good dry wood, seasoned and split cleanly, not a scrap pile, but deliberate work. There was no note. There was no name on anything. She looked at it for a while and could not account for it, and she went inside and made her supper and thought about it while she ate and could not decide what it meant. She did not find out until later, late November, a cold night with clear stars and no wind, the kind of night that looks like peace and kills livestock. Ottilie came inside after checking the drainage channel one last time and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark cabin and did not light the lamp. Her hands were bad. The months of daily use had irritated something deep in the tendons of her right wrist, and some evenings she could not fully close her fingers. Holloway had mentioned nerve damage, mentioned it carefully and with a kind of understatement that meant he was more concerned than he was showing. She looked at the table in the dark, at the outline of Glendon's notebook, which she had taken to keeping there, at the outline of the deed filed now in safe, at the outline of her own hands, which had done 3 months of work that men with twice her strength had told her could not be done, and which hurt in a way she was not sure would ever fully stop. She thought about everything that had happened since April. The funeral, Holloway with his $40 and his certainty, Merrifield with his document, the clay band, the dome ceiling, the cracked beam at 3 in the morning, the legal threat, the notebook, the 5 words at the bottom of Glendon's last sketch written by a man who had been thinking about the same thing she had been thinking about separately in the privacy of his own mind and had never said it out loud. She sat in the dark for a long time. Rook came and put his head on her knee. The weight of it was warm and exact, and she set her hand on the back of his neck and held it there. She did not cry loudly. She cried the way people cry when they have been holding something for so long that they have forgotten they were holding it quietly and without drama in a room where no one was watching. After a while, it stopped. She stayed at the table with her hand on Rook's neck and let the quiet come back into the room. Then she got up and blew out the spent candle stub and went to bed. The next morning, she was at the entrance of the chamber before the sun cleared the ridge. The work was not finished. The drainage still needed improvement on the east side. She had not yet installed the second shelf tier. The door hung slightly out of true and needed resetting in its frame. She picked up her tools and went to work. December settled over the valley and the work became completion rather than construction. She moved into the chamber on the winter solstice, the 21st of December, carrying her bedding and her cooking things in Glendon's notebook, in the brass thermometer, and Rook's blanket in 2 trips down the tunnel. She lit the fire for the first time in the finished space and sat on the edge of the bed and watched it. The draw worked exactly as she had designed it. The smoke went up and away, and the warmth came back and filled the oval room evenly, touching every wall, and the thermometer climbed to 62 degrees and held there. She slept that night more deeply than she had slept since Glendon died. On the 3rd day of January, Bassett Holloway rode over in the early afternoon with his collar turned up and his face pressed closed against the cold. He accepted coffee and stood near the hearth in the chamber for a few minutes without speaking, which with Holloway meant he was thinking about how to say something. A trader had come through from the north, he told her, a man who moved goods between the northern settlements and had seen a lot of winters in this territory. The trader had told Holloway that there was a weather system building to the north and west unlike anything he had seen since he was young. Cold beyond the normal range, moving faster than the usual fronts. The kind of thing that gave experienced men a particular feeling in the chest when they talked about it. Holloway did not dramatize this. He said it plainly the way he said most things. He said, if that man is right, no one in this valley is ready for it. Ottilie looked at him across the small fire. She looked at the chamber walls. She looked at the thermometer on the wall showing 62 degrees, while the January air outside pressed down on the land with a cold that had been building since October. She said when Holloway said he did not know for certain, soon, maybe very soon. He finished his coffee and rode home in the early dark. Ottilie sat for a while after he left. She checked her wood supply stacked against the sidewall under the shelf tier, enough for 3 weeks of steady burning. She checked her water fed from the spring crack at the back of the chamber that seeped clean and cold and never stopped. She checked her food stores. She checked the door and found it seated true, the oak boards fitted tight against the frame she had rebuilt twice to get right. Then she called Rook in from where he had been sitting at the entrance, looking at the stars, and she closed the door, and she sat down beside the fire with the notebook open on her knee, and she read again the 5 words that Glendon had written at the bottom of his last sketch, and she stayed with them for a long time in the warmth and the quiet before she finally slept. The 7th of January arrived with a sky that looked like nothing was wrong. That was the part Ottilie would remember later. Not the storm itself, but the morning before it, the way the air sat completely still, and the light came over the eastern ridge with an almost deliberate clarity, sharp and clean and cold, in a way that felt like a held breath rather than a threat. She had seen enough Montana winters to know that stillness before a front was not peace. It was preparation. The land knew what was coming before any instrument could measure it, and it went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone with authority walks through the door. She spent the morning of the 7th moving her last preparations into the chamber. An extra wool blanket she had been keeping in the cabin, the remainder of the coffee which she had been rationing since November. 3 more jars of preserved meat from the root shelf she had carved into the east wall. She made 2 trips, and on the second trip she looked north before she went inside and saw the horizon had changed color. Not dramatically, just a shade deeper than it should have been at that hour, a bruised color at the edge of the sky that she recognized the way you recognize a word in a foreign language after you have heard it used in anger once. She brought Rook inside and closed the door. By 4 in the afternoon, the wind had begun. By 6, it was no longer wind in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a continuous detonation happening in every direction at once, a sound that had no gaps in it, no pauses between gusts, just one sustained roar that pressed against the oak door of the chamber and did not stop pressing. Ottilie sat with her back against the wall near the hearth and listened to it and felt the earth around her hold its position with the same indifference it had always held. The temperature in the chamber was 60 degrees. Outside, she did not yet know how cold it was getting. She would learn later. She did not need to know that night. She fed the fire, she made tea, she read. Rook paced for the first hour, which he almost never did, going from the door to the hearth and back, his nails quiet on the plank floor, his ears tracking the sound above. Then something in him resolved, or perhaps he simply tired of the anxiety, and he lay down on his blanket and put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. Ottilie watched him settle and felt something of his decision pass into her as well. The first night passed. The second day of the storm, January 8th, Ottilie knew that it was worse than Holloway had suggested. The sound had not diminished. It had modulated, rising and falling in ways that were almost musical if you did not think about what was making them, but it had not lessened. She cleared the snow that had drifted against the base of the door twice in the morning, using a short-handled spade she kept inside for exactly this purpose. And both times the work took longer than it should have because the snow was not falling as much as it was being thrown packed hard against every surface it found. She was checking the chimney draw on the second afternoon, confirming that the vent was still clear, when she heard something that was not the storm. She went still. It came again. 3 sounds close together, irregular, not the rhythm of something structural shifting or settling. She crossed to the door and put her hand flat against the oak. She said, "Who is there?" The voice that came back was a man's, and it was in the condition that voices reach when a body has been pushing past its limits for so long that the muscles controlling speech have joined everything else in failing. She made out 2 words clearly. "Please, child." She took the rifle from the wall. She lifted the bar from the door brackets. She opened it. The Creston family stood in the entrance tunnel in the condition of people who have traveled through something that should have killed them. Whitmore Creston was 43 years old, and she recognized him by his height and the shape of his shoulders because his face was not recognizable, packed with snow and ice until the features were obscured. His wife Vera was slightly behind him with both arms wrapped around a shape that Ottilie needed a moment to understand was a child, their daughter Lena, 7 years old, bundled so completely that only a small oval of face was exposed, and that oval was the wrong color, too pale and too still. Ottilie stepped back from the door. She said inside, "Now." They came through and she closed the door behind them. And the cold that had entered with them was a physical thing, a presence that moved through the room and made the fire pull sideways for a moment before the chamber reclaimed its temperature. She was already at the hearth filling the tin pot from the water jug before the Crestons had fully registered where they were. She worked in the order she had worked out in her mind that autumn, when she had been thinking about what this space might need to do, beyond housing 1 woman and 1 dog. Blankets first, the dry ones from the bed and the extra from the shelf. The wet outer clothing came off and went in a pile near the door. Hot water from the pot, not boiling warm, administered by cup and spoon, because Vera Creston's hands were shaking too badly for her to hold anything without help. Lena made no sound for the first hour, and Ottilie kept her close to the fire and watched the child's color with the focused attention she had once given to a cracked ceiling beam, looking for the sign that would tell her whether what she was seeing was recoverable. The sign came near midnight. Lena opened her eyes, focused on the fire, and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite speech, but was unmistakably the sound of someone returning from a great distance. Vera Creston made a different sound entirely, the involuntary release of something she had been holding since before she found her way to this door, and Whitmore Creston put his face in his hands. Ottilie put more wood on the fire. When Whitmore Creston could speak properly, he told her what had happened. The wind had taken the roof of their farmhouse in the early afternoon of the 8th, peeling it back from the north wall in what he described as a single continuous motion like paper being torn. The walls had begun to fail within the hour. They had taken what they could carry and gone into the storm on foot because staying in a collapsing structure in those temperatures was a different kind of death, and they had chosen a movement over stillness. They had seen the smoke from Audley's chimney at some point, or thought they had through the white, and had moved toward it without being certain it was real. Whitmore said, "Everyone knows about the woman who dug herself into a mountain." He paused. He looked at the walls around him, the packed clay and the timber frame and the fire burning in the stone hearth. He said, "It does not seem so crazy now." Audley said nothing to that. She refilled his cup. The morning of the 9th brought no lessening of the storm. What it brought instead was company. Ezra Draper arrived first at some point before noon by her estimate, though the light through the chimney vent gave little indication of the hour. He was an old prospector who worked claims in the hills above the valley, and he had been caught in the open when the front came through and had followed her chimney smoke for 2 miles through conditions he described with the cheerful understatement of a man for whom survival had become something of a habit. He was frost-touched on both cheeks and 3 fingers of his left hand, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady, and he sat down near the Creston family and immediately began telling a story about a worse storm he had survived somewhere in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1871, which Audley suspected was exaggerated, but which served the useful purpose of giving everyone else something to evaluate rather than their own fear. Aurelia Pitcairn came next in the early afternoon with her infant son Michael, wrapped against her chest under 2 coats. She was 24 years old and had been homesteading alone on a small claim east of the valley since her husband had gone back to Ohio the previous spring and not returned. She had managed to keep her fire going for the first 20 hours of the storm, and then the flue had iced over and the fire had died, and she had tried for 3 hours to relight it in a house dropping toward temperatures that would kill an infant before they killed an adult. When she could not relight it, she had made the decision that Audley understood perfectly the decision to move rather than wait, and she had found her way across 2 miles of white chaos by following the fence line she knew ran from her property toward the valley trail, and from there toward the smoke she could sometimes see and sometimes not see, depending on what the wind was doing. Michael rapped against his mother's chest. Throughout all of this was warm and indignant and demanding to be fed, which he communicated with a clarity that needed no translation. Aurelia sat near the fire and attended to him with a focused efficiency that struck Audley as one of the more remarkable things she had witnessed. Cass Norgate came in the late afternoon. He came alone without a horse, which told the story before he did. He had been with 2 other hands from the Holloway Ranch, trying to locate a small group of cattle that had not come in before the storm, and they had been separated in the whiteout conditions sometime in the early morning. He had been walking for what he believed was 6 hours when he saw the smoke. He was 19 years old, and he had the look of someone who had spent those 6 hours in close enough proximity to dying that his face had not yet fully recovered its ordinary expression. He stood in the entrance of the chamber and looked at the people inside it and did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "I told you not to expect anyone to dig you out." Audley said, "Sit down, Cass." He sat. She gave him the last of the coffee. 8 people in a chamber built for one. Audley assessed the situation with the same methodical attention she had given every engineering problem over the past 4 months. Firewood adequate if managed carefully, perhaps 8 days of supply at current temperatures. Water continuous from the spring, no concern. Food tight, but not critical if rationed. Space genuinely constrained, but manageable with rotation, some people sleeping in shifts, while others sat against the walls. She found the balance by feel over the first evening, adjusting the fire in small increments, and watching the thermometer finding the setting that kept the chamber at 55 degrees without burning through the supply faster than it could be sustained. It was not comfortable. It was survival temperature, which was a different thing, and everyone in the room understood the difference without needing it explained. What happened in that chamber over the next hours was something that Audley had not designed for and could not have anticipated. 8 people in a small, warm room in the middle of an event that was killing people a few hundred yards away settled into a particular kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with choice. Ezra Draper told his stories. Vera Creston sang to Lena when the child had trouble sleeping. Whitmore Creston and Audley worked out the firewood rationing together in low voices without anyone asking them to take charge. It simply fell to the 2 of them because they were the people in the room most capable of it at that moment. Aurelia Pitcairn fed Michael and slept in 40-minute increments and woke with the precision of a woman whose body had already decided that sleep was a luxury to be taken in small pieces or not at all. Cass Norgate did not tell stories. He sat in the corner near the east wall shelf and was quiet for most of the first evening, and at some point late at night, Ottilie looked over and saw his shoulders moving in a way that told her what she needed to know without requiring her to look directly at his face. 19 years old, the first time he had come close enough to the end of things to understand what that meant. She had been 30 when she came close enough to understand it standing over a ravine in April, looking at what remained of her husband, and that had been bad enough. 19 was too young for it, and also exactly when it happened to most people, whether they were ready or not. She went to the shelf and took down the second tin cup she had not been using and poured the last of the hot water into it and set it on the floor near him without comment. He reached out and took it without looking up. She went back to the fire. An hour later, she heard the sound of wood being split. She turned and saw Cass on his feet near the wood pile with the small, splitting maul she kept for breaking larger pieces down to firebox size, working quietly and methodically in the corner of the chamber, adding to the split pile without being asked. He did not look at her. He did not look at anyone. He just worked in the steady, focused way of a person who has decided that the best available response to a situation is to make himself useful in it. She turned back to the fire without comment. There was nothing to say. It was simply true now that Cass Norgate was doing what needed doing, and the 19-year-old who had shouted something unkind from a horse in September was present in the room only as a faint residue, barely visible under the person who had replaced him. That was how it worked sometimes. Not through argument or confrontation or the formal acknowledgement of error, just through a night that asked more of a person than they had previously been asked to give, and the discovery of what they actually had when it was needed. The thought had barely settled when the knock came. Not 3 sounds this time, 2. Deliberate and heavy, the knock of a man who still had enough strength to mean it. Ottilie crossed to the door and said, "Who is there?" The voice came back immediately, rough with cold, but recognizable. It was Whitfield Holloway. She opened the door. He was not alone. He had one arm wrapped around the shoulders of a man she did not recognize, a traveler by the look of his gear, coated in ice from the collar down his right leg, dragging at an angle that told its own story. Holloway himself was in bad condition, his face white on the cheekbones and his eyebrows furred with frost, but his eyes were clear, and his grip on the stranger was steady. He said, "I found him on the North Trail. He cannot walk on his own." Ottilie stepped back from the door without a word. Holloway brought the man through, and they got him down onto the floor near the fire. The stranger's name, they learned later, was Doane Langton, a merchant who had been moving south from the northern settlements when the front overtook him on the open trail. His right foot was the problem. Even through his boot, the damage was evident, a stiffness and discoloration that Ottilie recognized, and that told her the foot needed warmth and time, and the particular kind of careful attention that came from not rushing the process. She worked on Langton while Holloway sat against the wall and let the chamber do what it had been built to do. The temperature in the room was 53 degrees by the thermometer, reduced again by the new arrivals, but holding. The fire was burning at the rate she had calculated, and the wood supply remained within her projections. 9 people now. The chamber held. At some point in the middle of the night, when Langton was stable and sleeping, and the others had arranged themselves as best they could in the available space, Holloway looked across the fire at Ottilie. He did not say anything for a long time. She did not prompt him. She had learned over the months since April that silence was not a problem that required solving. Sometimes it was simply what a moment asked for, and filling it before it was ready was a way of saying that your comfort with the silence mattered more than what the other person was trying to work up to saying. Then he said, "I signed that complaint in September." She said, "I know." He said, "I knew about the deed when I came to you after the funeral." She said, "I know that too." He looked at the fire. Around them, 8 other people breathed in the warmth that Ottilie had built out of clay and timber and the knowledge her father had carried home from underground for 30 years. Lena Creston was asleep against her mother's side, her face finally the right color again. Michael was asleep against Aurelia Pitcairn's chest with the uncomplicated confidence of a creature whose entire understanding of safety is the warmth of the person holding him. Ezra Draper had finally run out of stories and was snoring lightly in the corner. Holloway said, "I rode out tonight because I saw the smoke from your chimney, and I found that man on the trail, and there was nowhere else to bring him." She said, "Yes, He said, I am glad the chimney was burning. She said, so am I. He was quiet again, turning his cup in his hands. His face in the firelight was the face of a man accounting for something, adding up a column of figures and not liking the total. He said, I have been in this territory for 23 years. I have never seen a winter kill the way this one has. She said, it will come again. Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but it will come. He said, I know that now. It was the most honest conversation they had ever had, and it happened at 2 in the morning in the middle of the worst storm in territorial memory, with 9 people crowded into a room dug out of a hillside by a woman every one of them had at some point or another thought was making a mistake. On the morning of this 10th day of January, the wind stopped. It did not taper. It did not slow gradually and give warning. It stopped the way certain things stop when they have finished completely and without ceremony. And the silence that came after it was so absolute and so sudden that everyone in the chamber woke at nearly the same moment, roused by the absence of the sound they had been living inside for 3 days. Ottilie was already at the door. She lifted the bar and pushed it open against the weight of accumulated snow and stepped out into a world that had been remade in her absence. The sky was a blue so clear and deep, it looked manufactured, almost aggressive after 72 hours of gray and white. The snow lay in shapes that wind had sculpted without precedent in ordinary weather drifts 15 feet high against the north face of every structure still standing. The temperature was perhaps minus 10 degrees. After minus 40, it felt like something a person could negotiate with. She stood at the entrance and looked at the valley. The Creston farmhouse was a silhouette of partial walls with no roof. Another structure further east was simply gone. The valley looked like a place that had been contested between forces larger than anything that lived in it. Behind her, the 9 people came out one by one. The Crestons first, Whitmore helping Vera, who was still moving carefully on feet, not yet fully recovered. Lena came behind her mother and stood in the snow and looked at the blue sky with an expression Ottilie recognized, the particular disorientation of someone verifying that the world has continued to exist when they were not entirely certain it would. Ezra Draper emerged and nodded slowly, confirming something he had already expected. Aurelia Pitcairn stood at the tunnel entrance with Michael against her chest, one hand shading her eyes. Cass Norgate was next. He stood beside Ottilie and looked at the valley without speaking for a while. Then he said, how many people did not have what you built? It was not quite a question, and Ottilie did not answer it as one. Don Langton came last, leaning against the doorframe, his right foot wrapped in the strips of wool Ottilie had used to pack it through the night. He would keep the foot. He would walk differently for the rest of his life, but he would walk. Holloway stood apart from the others, looking at the valley with the expression of a man making a private accounting. Ottilie said, go back inside and get warm. We will deal with what comes next when we know what it is. What it was became apparent over the following days as the valley dug itself out and took its account of the damage. 4 people in the valley had died, including a child from a homestead on the far east side whose family had not been found for 2 days after the storm broke. Across the Northern Territories, the count was still incomplete, but already past 200 and climbing. Structures that had stood for years were gone or damaged beyond what could be repaired before the next winter. The Creston farmhouse was a total loss. Several other families were examining whether their operations could continue through spring, whether the livestock losses and structural damage together added up to an insurmountable subtraction from everything they had built. Ottilie's chamber had lost nothing. The fire had not gone out. The spring at the back of the chamber had not frozen. The roof had not shifted by so much as the thickness of a thumbnail. Don Langton left the valley 2 weeks after the storm, with his foot wrapped and his gait permanently altered, but alive and walking under his own power. He had sat in the chamber for several hours on his last morning and asked questions about the construction in the focused way of a man who intended to do something with the answers. He told Ottilie that he traveled to the northern settlements 4 times a year and that the winters there were worse than what she had just seen, and the distances between homesteads were greater. He said, I am going to tell a people what I saw here. She said, tell them everything. Tell them what went wrong in the valley as well as what went right. The failures are as useful as the successes. He nodded and rode north, and she watched him go with the particular feeling of watching something set in motion that would continue past the point where you could see it. The news of the 9 survivors spread through the valley before the snow was cleared, from the roads carried by the survivors themselves and by the people who came looking for them. By the end of the 2nd week after the storm, Audley had received visitors. She did not know people from other parts of the valley and from the town itself who had heard the story and wanted to see what they were hearing about. She showed the chamber to anyone who came with genuine curiosity and turned away the ones who came to gawk at the spectacle of a woman who had been right when everyone said she was wrong. She had no interest in spectacle. She had interest in the question of how many people in this territory were going into next winter in structures that would kill them and what could be done about it before then. Truxton Merrifield came on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks after the storm. No uniform, no papers. He stood in the entrance of the chamber for a long time without speaking, which was unusual for a man whose professional identity was built entirely on the delivery of information without personal commentary. Then he said, "You were right. I was doing my job when I came out here in September." Audley said, "I know that, Deputy Marshal Merrifield, but I would like to know who asked you to do it on that particular day about that particular complaint." Merrifield looked at her. His face remained neutral, but something behind it shifted slightly. The adjustment of a man who has walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and found a different one waiting. He said, "Whitfield Holloway is a property owner in this county with legal standing to file complaints about adjacent land use." She said, "That is not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it again more slowly with the particular cadence of a man choosing his words with care. "Whitfield Holloway is a property owner in this county with legal standing to file complaints about adjacent land use." The repetition was his answer. Not an admission, not a denial, just the facts of the matter stated twice, leaving her to draw her own conclusions from what he had chosen to say and what he had chosen not to say. Audley looked at him steadily. She said, "Thank you, Deputy Marshal. I already knew that." Merrifield left. She watched him ride down the trail until the bend took him. She was not angry. She had not been angry since October, when she had understood what Holloway had done with the land records. Anger was what you felt when something surprised you, and she had not been surprised in some time. But she filed the conversation in the same place she kept information that would be useful when something needed to be resolved, and she knew the resolution was coming. That resolution with Holloway came on a Saturday at the end of January. He rode up alone. No hands, no papers in his coat. He dismounted in the yard and stood with his hat in his hands, and the posture said what he had come to say before he said a word of it. He was looking at the ground the way men look at the ground when they are deciding how to begin something they do not know how to begin. Audley waited. She had gotten good at waiting. He said, "I want to speak to you about the land dispute filing." He said, "I am withdrawing it." Audley said nothing. He said, "I filed it because the deed situation was unclear at the time, and I thought the land might become available. That was my reasoning. I am not saying it was good reasoning." He stopped. He seemed to expect something from her at this point, a response, an acknowledgement, some indication of how the ground lay between them. She gave him none of that. She looked at him and let the silence do what it did to a man who was accustomed to filling it. Audley looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I am not teaching the design for firewood and eggs anymore. If you want to learn how to build a chamber like this one, you will help me build 7 of them first. One for the Creston family because their house is gone. One for the Pitcairn woman on the east side because she is alone with an infant and she nearly died in that storm. 5 more for families in this valley I have already identified who are most vulnerable to what comes next winter. When those 7 are done, I will show you everything you need to know to build one for your ranch." Holloway was quiet for a long time. He looked at the chamber entrance. He looked at the valley below, still half buried in January snow, the shapes of damaged structures visible at the distances where they had stood whole a month ago. He said, "That is a lot of labor." Audley said, "Yes, it is." He put his hat back on. He looked at her with something that had moved past the old certainty and had not yet settled into whatever was going to replace it. He said, "When do we start?" She told him. He rode away, and this time he did not look back. That evening, Audley sat at the entrance of her chamber in the last of the January light, with Rook beside her. The valley held its cold with the same reliable indifference it always had. But it had something it had not had before January 7th. The knowledge that warmth was possible in conditions that had previously made it seem like accident. The understanding that the ground under every homestead had been holding something in reserve, waiting for someone to ask for it the right way. Bassett Holloway came by the following week with a letter from a newspaper in Billings. The territorial governor's office had sent an inquiry. Word was traveling. He said it is going to get louder before it gets quieter. She said, "Let it." She folded the letter and put it in Glendon's box alongside the deed and the notebook and the photograph from the first year on the claim. Outside, the last of the January light went over the ridge, and the stars came out one by one, over a valley that was cold and in some of its houses now, and in more of them soon warm. Spring came to the valley not gently but argumentatively. Warm days interrupted by cold ones, mud that froze overnight and thawed again by noon, the snow retreating in patches that revealed the previous autumn's dead grass flattened and pale. Audley did not wait for the ground to fully thaw before she started the first of the 7 chambers. The Creston family had been surviving in the one interior room whose walls had held through the storm, heated by a small iron stove Whitmore Creston had salvaged from the wreckage of his kitchen. Lena had recovered fully the color back in her face and her voice returned to its ordinary volume, which was considerable. But no one should plan on another winter in that room. The site she selected for the Creston chamber was a low hillside behind what remained of their barn. She walked it with Whitmore on a Saturday morning in late March, pushing a steel rod into the softened ground at intervals to test the soil profile. When she found the band she was looking for, she drove a stake into the earth and told him this was where they would begin. Holloway arrived that same morning with 2 of his ranch hands in a wagon loaded with timber. He climbed down from the wagon, looked at the stake, looked at the hillside, and said, "Tell me where to start." She told him. What followed over the next 6 weeks was different in character from her solitary autumn work, noisier and more complicated, and requiring a constant negotiation between people with different levels of skill and different instincts about how to accomplish any given task. Holloway was a competent man with his hands, but he had spent 20 years giving directions rather than following them, and there were moments in the early days when the friction between his instinct to decide and Audley's role as the person who knew what she was doing produced a particular kind of silence that both of them had to choose to let pass. He let it pass. She adjusted her approach in small ways that did not concede anything essential, but made the collaboration functional. By the middle of April, the Creston chamber was complete. Lena was the first one inside after Audley ducking through the entrance tunnel with the fearlessness of a 7-year-old who associated this kind of space with warmth and safety, and she emerged 30 seconds later to report to her mother that it smelled like the other one. Vera Cresson stood at the entrance with her hands folded in front of her and looked at the hillside that now contained a room where her family would sleep through the next winter. She said to Audley, "I do not know how to say what I want to say." Audley said, "You already said it." The second chamber went faster than the first, the third faster still. Cass Norgate had become, without any formal designation, Audley's most reliable worker on the project, arriving before Holloway's hands most mornings and staying after they left, developing a competency with the shoring work that Audley recognized as genuine aptitude rather than simple willingness. He did not talk about the night he had spent in the original chamber. He worked and the work said what it said. Aurelia Pitcairn's chamber was the 4th. The site had a more complex drainage situation that required an additional lateral channel to manage the spring runoff. Audley drove the crew through the drainage work without apology because she had learned in her own construction that drainage was never the interesting part until it failed, at which point it became the only part. When the chamber was finished, Aurelia stood inside it with Michael on her hip. The boy was 3 months old now and had recently discovered that the world contained things worth looking at, and he turned his head toward the small fire in the hearth with an expression of profound interest. Aurelia said, "Last winter, I thought about going back to Ohio." Audley said, "I know. A lot of people thought about that." Aurelia said, "I am not thinking about it anymore." The 5th and 6th chambers were on properties on the north side of the valley, the homesteads most exposed to fronts coming down from the north. Audley had ridden the circuit of those properties in February and had honest conversations with people about what the next repetition of January would do to their current structures. She had not softened the assessment. Both families had listened. Both had agreed to the work. The 7th chamber was different. She had not announced it as part of the agreement with Holloway. She kept it in reserve until the 6th was finished and the crew was standing around the wagon in the late afternoon light of a May evening, tired and muddy, and satisfied in the way that comes from completing a thing you were not certain you could complete. Holloway said, "That is 6. You said 7. Audley said the 7th one is yours." He looked at her. "She said the north hillside behind your main barn has a clay band at about 8 feet that will hold a chamber large enough for your family and 6 additional people. Your hands can dig it. I will come and direct the shoring and the chimney work. He was quiet for a long time. He said that was not the arrangement. The arrangement was, I help build 7, and then you teach me. Audley said, I am teaching you right now by telling you exactly where to dig and what you will find when you get there. I changed the terms. He said, why? She said, because you rode out in a storm that was killing people to pull a stranger off the road and bring him to my door. You did not do that because of any arrangement, so I am not doing this because of any arrangement either. Holloway looked at her with an expression working its way through several others to get where it was going. He said, all right. She said, your hands know the work now. They were good workers. You should pay them accordingly. He almost smiled. He said, are you in the habit of telling men how to run their operations, Mrs. Birdsong? She said, I am in the habit of saying what I think is true, Mr. Holloway. I have found it saves a great deal of time. He rode away, and for the first time since she had known him, the riding away felt like a departure rather than a retreat. The work on Holloway's chamber took 3 weeks and was completed in the first days of June. Bassett Holloway came to see it when it was done, walked through the entrance tunnel, stood in the finished space, and came back out to stand beside Audley in the afternoon sun. He said, how many of these are there now, counting yours? She said, 9 counting mine. There will be more. He said, I have been thinking about writing a proper account of the construction method, something that could be reproduced and distributed. She said, do it. Use my name or do not use my name. It does not matter. The information is what matters. He said it matters to the people who will read it. A name makes it real. A name means someone stood behind it. She thought about Glendon's notebook, the 5 words at the bottom of the last sketch, the way a person could think something important for a long time in silence and then not be there to say it when the time came. She said, use my name. That summer was the first summer in 3 years that Audley did not spend entirely in survival preparation. The chambers were built. The drainage was finished. She had, for the first time since arriving in Montana, something that resembled margin. She used some of it to teach. The first formal session was in July, held outside her chamber on a dry afternoon, with 17 people sitting on the hillside or standing at the back. Word had spread through the valley the way information spreads when it has already demonstrated its value person to person, until enough people had asked that scheduling a single gathering was simpler than repeating herself indefinitely. She covered site selection first because that was where most failures began, where people chose convenience over geology and paid for it later. She covered drainage before construction because she had seen the Pitcairn property's drainage problem teach more about the principle than any explanation she could give. She covered the shoring with actual timber pieces she brought out of her chamber, showing the notch joint with her hands until the people at the back could see it clearly, the way the notch locked the horizontal beam into the vertical post so that the weight of the earth above distributed across the whole frame rather than concentrating at any single point. She did not cover the thermal principles of the earth because she had covered them once in the second week of her own construction, and covering them again would suggest people had not understood the first time, which was an insult dressed as instruction. Between the formal explanations, she answered questions, and the questions told her where people's minds were working. Some were thinking about cost, how much timber, how much labor, how long it would take. Some were thinking about their specific situations, a north-facing slope, a clay content they were not certain about, a drainage problem she would need to see in person to assess properly. Some were asking questions that revealed they were already committed and wanted confirmation more than instruction, and those she answered briefly and moved on from because they did not need more from her than she had already given. What she found over the course of 3 hours on that hillside was that 17 people had arrived willing to believe what she had built was an unusual thing done by an unusual person in unusual circumstances. Most of them left understanding that it was a replicable method built on principles that anyone with enough patience and enough attention to the specific qualities of the ground beneath their feet could learn and apply. That was the difference between a story and a technique, and Audley had decided some time ago that what she was offering was the second thing. Holloway sat at the back and asked no questions, which told her he had been paying attention during the building work. Cass Norgate sat near the front and asked 2 questions better than most of the others, specific and practical, and rooted in things he had seen go wrong during construction. She answered them fully. Whitmore Creston sat beside his wife Vera, Lena sat between her parents with her legs crossed and her chin resting on her fists, watching Ottilie with the complete attention of a child who has decided that this particular adult is worth studying. When it was over, people stayed to talk in the way that people stay when they have been given something they want to keep examining. Ottilie answered questions for another hour. She accepted an invitation to visit two properties on the far side of the valley where the owners wanted her opinion on potential sites. She declined an offer of payment, which made the offerer uncomfortable, until she explained that she was not declining out of modesty, but because she had thought about it carefully and decided that payment for this specific kind of knowledge introduced a dynamic she did not want. She said, "If I charge you, you come to me with your questions. If I do not charge you, you figure out what you can and come to me with the ones you cannot." The second way produces better builders. The man who had offered payment thought about this for a moment and then nodded, which told her he had understood it, and she moved on. There was a woman at the back of the group who had not asked any questions during the session and came to find Ottilie at the end after most of the others had left. She was somewhere in her mid-40s with the specific kind of quietness that comes not from shyness, but from long practice at watching before speaking. Her name was Cordelia Fawcett, and she had a claim on the far south side of the valley that Ottilie had not yet visited. She said, "I want to ask you something that is not about the construction." Ottilie waited. She said, "When you started digging in September, before you knew it was going to work, what did you do with the not knowing?" Ottilie thought about this. She said, "I kept digging." Cordelia Fawcett looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "That is what I thought. That is what I needed to hear someone say out loud." She walked back to where her horse was tied. Ottilie watched her go and thought that this was perhaps the most important conversation she had had all day, and she had not known it was coming. The second class happened in August, the third in September. By the third class, the people attending included some who had come from outside the immediate valley, word having traveled further than she had expected, and Halloway's written account having been reproduced in 2 territorial papers by that point, with enough detail to send people looking for the source. A man named Lorne Varnells attended the September class, a former military engineer from the Eastern Territories who had ridden 3 days to be there. He sat through the entire session without speaking and came to find Ottilie afterward with hand-drawn plans showing modifications to her shoring design that used a different joint geometry from fortification construction, allowing wider spans without additional posts. She looked at the plans. She asked 2 questions. She asked him to demonstrate the joint on a small scale with the timber pieces she had available. He showed her. The joint was cleaner than hers. It would hold more weight with less material. Then she said, "This is better than what I have been doing." He looked surprised in the particular way of a man who came prepared for resistance and found none. She said, "I am going to use this. I will tell people where it came from." He said, "You do not need to do that." She said, "I know I do not need to. That is why I am going to." She incorporated his joint into her teaching the following spring. She incorporated a ventilation modification from a Swedish homesteader 2 valleys over, who had solved a moisture problem she had not fully resolved in humid conditions. She incorporated a foundation approach from an older Blackfeet man named Standing Elk, who came to one of her sessions and afterwards showed her a method of reading soil stability that had been in use among his people for longer than the territorial government had existed, more reliable in certain soil types than the probe method she had developed on her own. She wrote all of it into a single document that autumn working at her table in the chamber by lamplight, and she gave it to Halloway to add to his account. The document had no title. A working record should look like what it was, rather than pretending to a finality it had not reached. There was more to learn. There would always be more to learn. The document was a record of what several people had figured out so far, and its most important quality was that it was honest about the limits of what it knew. She was 32 years old. The second winter after the storm was cold but not catastrophic, testing the chambers she had helped build and finding them adequate. The Creston family emerged in March with Lena 2 inches taller and Whitmore Creston wearing the settled expression of a man who has stopped waiting to find out whether something is going to work. Cass Norgate spent that winter working a claim of his own, a small piece of land he had filed on in October on the strength of wages he had saved working for Holloway and then for the chamber construction projects through the spring and summer. He had started his own chamber in September without asking Ottilie for help with the design, having decided that he knew enough to proceed on his own, which she thought was probably true. He had asked her to look at his chimney placement before he committed to the final angle, which was the right question to ask, because chimney placement was where experience mattered most, and experience was the one thing he did not yet have enough of. She had looked at it and told him to move it 8 inches to the west to account for the way the prevailing wind came off the ridge above his site. He had moved it 8 inches to the west without argument or question, which she thought was the sign of a man who had understood the most important thing about learning a skill, that knowing enough to proceed and knowing enough to defer are not contradictory. They are both required. Holloway's chamber at the ranch was finished and functional before the first hard freeze. He did not speak about it in the expansive way that some of the converts to the method did, men who had been skeptical and then convinced, and who processed the conversion by becoming advocates, telling everyone they knew about the principles with the enthusiasm of people who had recently discovered a religion. Holloway simply used it and maintained it and paid his hands the wage adjustment Ottilie had suggested in May, without mentioning that she had suggested it, which she found out about from one of the hands in August and noted without comment. He came to see her once that winter in December with a question about moisture sealing on his chamber's east wall that had developed a problem she had seen before in hillsides with a particular drainage pattern beneath the clay band. She told him the solution in 2 sentences. He fixed it. He came back a week later to tell her it had worked, which was not strictly necessary, but which she understood as its own kind of communication, the functional language of a man who did not use words for anything that could be accomplished by showing up. It was she had come to understand the way Whitfield Holloway said thank you, and she had decided some time ago to accept it as the genuine thing it was. The third spring brought 17 new chambers in the valley, and the surrounding area, not counting the ones outside Ottilie's direct knowledge, that Holloway reported having heard about in his correspondence with people who had read his published account. A military post to the north was reportedly investigating the method for application to its cold weather facilities, which presented scale problems she had not worked through yet, but which she thought about with interest. A settlement further east had built 3 chambers and sent a letter asking if Ottilie would be willing to visit and consult on a larger communal structure, a shared refuge designed to house 30 people in an emergency, which presented engineering questions she had not yet solved, in which she wrote back to say she was thinking about. She was thinking about a lot of things that spring. The communal structure problem occupied a portion of her attention that she found genuinely pleasurable. The particular engagement of a problem that had no established answer and required building the solution from the foundation rather than adapting an existing approach. She worked on it in the evenings with paper and a stick of charcoal, drawing cross-sections and calculating load distributions, making the same kinds of notes Glendon had made in his notebook, the same careful, deliberate handwriting of someone thinking through each mark before committing it to the page. She was not Glendon, and her engineering was more developed than his sketches had been, but the posture was the same, a person sitting alone in a warm room at night, trying to figure out how to keep other people from freezing. She thought about Glendon less with pain now, and more with something that had changed its character over the 2 years since the storm, a presence rather than an absence, the particular way the dead become part of how the living think, rather than a wound in the thinking. She kept his notebook on the shelf above the hearth. She did not read it often anymore. She did not need to. The 5 words at the bottom of the last page had done what they were going to do, which was give her permission to begin something she would have begun anyway, but perhaps not with the same certainty, perhaps not with the specific weight of knowing that she was finishing something he had started. Rook was getting older. He moved more slowly in the mornings, taking longer to rise from his blanket, with the considered deliberateness of a creature learning to manage what time had done to his joints. But his eyes were the same. They tracked her movements with the same steady attention, and when she sat at the table in the evenings, he would come and put his head on her knee with the same weight and exactness as if the gesture had been calibrated once and did not require revision. She had never stopped being grateful for that weight. On an evening in September of that 3rd year, Ottilie sat at the entrance of her chamber as the light went low over the valley and watched the hillsides darken one by one. From where she sat, she could count 5 vent openings on 5 different slopes, each one marking a chamber that had not existed 2 years ago, each one representing a family that would go into the next winter with something they had not had before. There were more she could not see from here, more beyond the ridge to the east, more in the settlements to the north where Holloway's account had traveled and taken root in the minds of people she had never met who were solving the same problems she had solved with the information she had given them freely and completely without asking what they would do with it. She had not become wealthy. She had not become famous in any way that altered how she lived from day to day. She had what she had come to Montana with: the land and the whir and the specific, irreplaceable companionship of a dog who had been present for all of it, from the first swing of the pickaxe to the morning the storm broke to this evening in September, with the light going amber over the hills and the first hint of autumn cold in the air. She had something she had not come with: the knowledge that the thing she had built in the hillside was not only a shelter for one woman and one dog, but a proof of a principle that other people could use and had used and would continue to use in ways she could not predict or control, which was exactly as it should be. Knowledge was not like land or cattle or timber. It did not diminish when you gave it away. It grew. Every person who learned from her and taught someone else added to it, corrected it, improved on it, discovered problems she had not seen, and solved them in ways that came back to her as new knowledge in turn. Lorne Vernell's joint, standing elk's soil method, the Swedish homesteader's ventilation solution, Doane Langton carrying word north to settlements she would never see, Cass Norgate building his own chamber with enough confidence to know where the chimney needed to be moved without being told twice. The document she had written had already been revised twice by Holloway based on things people had told him after reading it and going out and building. What she had started in September of 1887 with a pickaxe in a hillside and the contents of a locked box was no longer hers in any proprietary sense. It had grown past her authorship into something that belonged to the problem it solved, and the problem belonged to everyone who lived in a place where winters could kill. Holloway had written to her in August with a question about attribution for the revised version of his account. He wanted to include the contributions of Varnell's joint and Standing Elk's soil reading method and the Swedish homesteader's moisture solution, and he wanted to know how she wanted it presented. She had written back, presented as what it is, a collection of what several people figured out together because they were all trying to solve the same problem. My name can be first because I started first. Everyone else's name should be in it because they made it better than I could have made it alone. Do not suggest that any one person invented this. That is not what happened, and it is not a true thing to say. He had written back, you are making this more complicated than it needs to be. She had written back, you are a former judge. You should know better than anyone that getting the facts right is never more complicated than it needs to be. He had not responded to that which she interpreted as agreement. The light finished going over the ridge, and the first stars appeared in the east, the same stars that had been above this valley every clear night since before anyone now living had been born, and that would be above it long after everyone now living was gone. Rook lifted his head from her knee and looked at the darkening sky for a moment with the same interest he gave to most things, thorough and without urgency, then set his chin back down. Ottilie looked at the stars for a while. She thought about her father 3 decades underground in Cornwall, coming home every evening smelling of the deep earth, carrying the knowledge of what lay below the surface, in the same ordinary way he carried everything else, as simple fact rather than discovery. He had given her that knowledge at a dinner table in England 20 years ago and had no idea what she would eventually do with it. He had died before she came to Montana. He had never seen the hillside. He had never felt the temperature of the chamber he had, in some indirect but real sense, helped her build. She thought about the notebook, the sketch, the 5 words. She thought about the 9 people who had come through her door in a January storm 2 years ago, each of them carrying the specific weight of a person who has just understood how close the margin is between the life they are living and the end of it. She thought about Lena Creston, 7 years old, opening her eyes in the firelight and making the sound of someone coming back. The valley was dark now, except for the scattered lights of the homesteads below, small and separate and persistent, the same lights that had been there before the storm, and that were still there because of what enough people had decided to do about the cold. She put her hand on Rook's head. The old dog made a sound low in his chest, comfortable and undemanding. She said, "We are warm," not to the dog, not to anyone in particular, to the valley and the hillside and the deep, steady earth that had been holding its temperature patiently since long before any of them arrived, and would hold it patiently long after all of them were gone. The night settled over Montana with the same indifference it always had. Inside the chamber, the fire held.